Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. In our last lecture, we observed the very vital and the most significant concept in the study of literature that stylistics takes into account. That is the concept of foregrounding. Now that we had understood with the reference to many critics and linguists that the literary language is foregrounded, and the foregrounding in literary language serves as a means of making the understanding of a concept not only complicated and difficult, but also it enhances the beauty of writing. And on the basis of the concept of foregrounding, any piece of writing is distinguished as a literary piece from the ordinary writing. When we say that the ordinary language is distinguished on the basis of foregrounding, then we must look at what are the concepts, features that are found in the concept of foregrounding, so that a writer utilizes this concept in order to make his text appear strange, unusual, unfamiliar, and worth noticing to the reader. So in today's lecture, we will try to recap a little about what the concept of foregrounding means, and in order to understand this concept with reference to the fact that we as the literary critics and the linguists who are now learning to be stylisticians, how would we focus on a text, on the language of literary writing, if we are supposed to find out its foregrounded features, and what are the inherent meanings that these foregrounded features reveal, and then how do they enhance the overall meaning of a text and the overall composition of a piece of writing. In the last lecture, we looked at the distinction between the concept of defamiliarization and automatization. We looked at the very fact that when we talk about the idea that a writer makes something appear unusual, unfamiliar, and strange, that we might have become quite habitual to or used to. If a writer is presenting something in a new light, using a metaphor, a conceit, or a comparison, or a symbol which makes us believe, if a writer is making use of a concept that we are familiar with, but in order to make us understand that concept through a metaphor or a simile or a personification or maybe a symbol, he wishes to enhance our understanding of something that we have been taking for granted. A simple thing in nature would be explained as if we have never seen it before. And that is only possible through the concept of defamiliarization. So by making a thing that is known and familiar appear strange to the reader, the writer is making use of the technique or the theory of foregrounding. And within foregrounding, he is making use of making things appear strange through defamiliarization. So there are two ways at the disposal of a writer: either to make things appear strange and unusual when he creates something in his writing, or to make it appear simple, regular, and usual. That he can do through automatization. So this is how we distinguish between defamiliarization and automatization, though both these concepts come under the umbrella of the theory of foregrounding. To bring something to the front or highlight it, a writer may use a device of comparison which makes us feel as if it is unbelievable, it is paradoxical, or it is sort of unfamiliar. Similarly, a writer may stick to a pattern, like he may use maybe the use of repetition on words, on sounds, for example in alliteration. So if a writer uses alliterative pattern and the reader becomes familiar with the fact that the writer would repeat these sound patterns either in the beginning lines of every stanza or every third line of the stanza, then this would become automatization, because the reader is familiarized with the fact that the writer would repeat the same pattern and make it appear regular and automatic. On contrary to that concept of automatization, where structures, things, ideas are repeated to familiarize the reader or to make the pattern appear automatic, There exists another way of presenting things that is the opposite of automatization and is referred to as defamiliarization, where the writer makes an apparently very normal, usual, regular thing appear as irregular, strange, unusual, and at times ambiguous. So, if a writer is using the concept of foregrounding, within that he has two options available. To make something prominent in the text, he either can follow the pattern that would be automatic, hence referred to as automatization, and he can follow a pattern that is irregular, referred to as defamiliarization. So these are the two options available to a reader to look at the text as well. He also locates in the text such features which are regular patterns or the regular features of writing, which are repetitions, or which are maybe the exact ways a writer has put his words with the help of a similarity that he has created within the words or statements, or even construction or syntax. Then, on the other hand, a reader may focus his attention in the understanding of a literary writing on the irregular patterns, on the jolts, on the hindrances that occur in the comprehension of a writing. So those jolts and hindrances which the reader receives as something that is disturbing him or stopping him from the understanding of the work, these appear to be defamiliarizations. And in the terms of stylistics, mostly writers refer to defamiliarization as deviation, which is deviating from the norms, violating the norms of writing or the principles and rules of writing. On the other hand, automatization is achieved through parallelism, which means making things parallel and same. So the very meaning of these terms is embedded in these words. Deviation means to deviate, to disturb, to change, to disrupt, and parallelism means to make it similar, same, parallel. And as the stylistic devices or techniques which the writers employ for the sake of creating deviation or irregularity or parallelism or regularity, these devices are called tropes and schemes. Now this is the way, the hierarchical way, the concept of foregrounding would lead us to. The very minute details of a text, that would be the schemes and tropes that would we would be learning in the coming few lectures, that how through tropes and schemes the writers make use of certain literary devices which either are helping them to create familiarity of the reader for the text and the regular patterns within the text, that is the automatization, and there are tropes or certain devices called tropes which are used to make the reader's comprehension get tested and challenged while reading. So this is how the concept of foregrounding or the theory of foregrounding, presented by many theorists like Victor Shklovsky, John Makarowski, and also it has been backed up by Widdowson and certain writers like Jeffrey Leach, the critic and the most prominent writer who has commented on the importance of style and stylistics in the recent years. Now, keeping in view the very diagram that the umbrella term foregrounding, that is also referred to as foregrounding theory, encompasses within it two concepts. The two concepts that are there within the idea of foregrounding are called defamiliarization and automatization. Defamiliarization is also called deviation, and automatization is also called parallelism. And to achieve parallelism, writers make use of devices called schemes, and to make use of deviation, writers make use of devices called tropes. Now let us look at the significance of foregrounding, what it has to offer to literature, and what is its significance for a stylistician when he is to interpret a text, and how a reader too is affected by such a device which a writer has employed for the sake of enhancing the style of writing and differentiating it from what other writers have written, and also to differentiate it from what the ordinary writing presents to us. We looked at in the last lecture at the concept of foregrounding from the perspective of art, as the critics in art have contributed to the art criticism, enhancing the value of a piece of art on the basis of the fact that how it is distinguished from mass-produced regularities, from the paintings that are the picture of reality or what the eye witnesses in the surroundings. If that is the same thing that a painting paints, then there is no art in it. A photographic reality is the photocopy of the same thing that is seen through a naked eye. But when a painter infuses into it something of his own, for example, the color, the hues, the shades, which are not found really in reality, but he uses them, seeing it with his own eye rather than the eye of reality, there occurs the problem of interpretation, that what meanings a writer's eye has given to the sights that he has witnessed. Now, since the concept of foregrounding has been borrowed in literature from art, we look at the very fact that how the critics define the piece of writing also as an art or a painting. To the stylisticians or the literary critics who believe that foregrounding is the most significant a feature in a text, they look at the text also as a piece of art, like a painting. And when in a painting there is a background against which a foreground or an object is set, then it makes us clear to understand the analogy between a painting and a poem. Within a poem, a writer might have used so many words, so many lines and ideas, but a few of the words, because of their deviation, because of their difference from what is normally uttered in conversations, in speeches, or in the talks, this text's particular features would come to the foreground. The way we looked at the example of Donne's famous conceit in the poem Valediction Forbidding Mourning, that you forget the rest of the poem and begin to concentrate on the extended metaphor or a very far-fetched comparison, which we refer to as a conceit, that is of a compass. Now, the rest of the poem, its ideas, its words, its language, its features recede into the background, and our attention as a reader or a critic is focused on the conceit of a compass. Now, the conceit emerges as a device, a foregrounded feature that deviates or breaks the norms of writing, and the reader is forced to understand the meanings of the depth of the meaning of this conceit. So, as a painting acts against a background of norms and regularities, and the artist's skill lies in not mechanically reproducing those things that he sees in the surroundings, but in introducing unexpected departures from them. So the writer's skill in the writing of a poem also lies not in narrating the story, the way something happened, but in capturing the essence of the emotion and feeling that would be conveyed through a device. And in case of Donne's poem, it is conveyed through the device of a conceit. Jeffrey Leach, in his book A Linguistic Guide to English Poetry, states that as a general rule, anyone who wishes to investigate the significance or the value of a work of art must concentrate on the element of interest and surprise rather than on automatic pattern. So Jeffrey Leach in this quotation is guiding the reader and the critic to focus on the unusual, unexpected patterns or features of a poem or a text, because a poem is the expression of a feeling. It is not something that has been seen and is described. Rather, it is something that has been felt, and to understand the poem in the same way, with the same emotion that the writer felt while writing it or composing it. It can only be conveyed with the sense that the reader is surprised and takes interest in those devices and words which appear unusual, strange, different, and even thought-provoking to him. So if a reader is to assimilate an idea and comprehend an idea, that idea has to be presented in an unusual way, because only a deviant or a foregrounded feature would make us stop and think, and then we will take interest in the device used or in the symbol used, and we will be surprised how that device appears to be an innovation or a novelty of a writer's skill and writing. So this is how Jeffrey Leach describes the importance of foregrounding in literary writing, that foregrounded features evoke the interest of a reader, and they also make us feel surprised at how the writer has perceived something usual in a very unusual way, and we feel as if we had never felt this way about this idea or a thing, the way the writer has thought about it. So this is where lies the beauty, the charm of a literary writing, and here is where the job of a stylistician or a critic is becoming complicated, because if the poem is to be paraphrased, that would lose the meaning. But if the poem's features, symbols, and stylistic devices are picked up and looked at with great detail, because they are deviant, because they are foregrounded features, that would be really something that would elaborate to us the meaning of a text. So instead of paraphrasing a poem, we concentrate on understanding the in-depth meaning of the poem through the study of its devices, its imagery, its features, and its symbols. So the critics reveal that such departures from norms and rules of writing and expression are given a special name of foregrounding, and this concept evokes the analogy of a figure that is seen against a background. Then the artistic deviation, that is the device, maybe a conceit or a metaphor, it sticks out from its background, and the automatic system or the pattern of language lies there in the background, just supporting it and backing it up. Now the figure, like a visual aid in the foreground, becomes the focal point of the attention of the reader and critic. Now the application of this concept, that is the concept of foregrounding, is most abundantly and most regularly found in poetry. And if we look at the examples of such things which we may term as foregrounded features of a poem or a text, we may be surprised at how these features convey a feeling, enhance a thought, deepen the meaning, maybe are also associated with emotive feelings or emotions of the reader. Now they add to the value of a text. Something that has made expression compact or brief is something on its closer scrutiny would reveal layers of meaning and expand the meaning before us. So it's the irony of the foregrounded features, that they appear just a single word, they may be just a single metaphor or a symbol, but being single and one would be a kind of its appearance. That is, it would in the depth be carrying multiple meanings. So that is why the significance of understanding of the foregrounded features is also enhanced for the study of stylistics. Look at this example that is from the poet Dylan Thomas's poem. Dylan Thomas has used the phrase in his poem that is, "a grief ago." Now in a poem he makes use of this phrase, that is, "a grief ago." Now a reader, when comes across such an expression where the poet is stating something that he had been like this a grief ago. Now it is unusual because we do not measure time in this way. Rather, it should have been a year ago, a month ago, But here he doesn't use the regular way of expression of the passage of time. Now the poet is not measuring the passage of time with the regular features of time, that is day, week, month, year. But he associates it with grief, as if grief is an apt measure of time. Now look how the beauty, the depth of the poem, the poet's message has increased with such a deviation, and the reader focuses the reader focuses his attention on this unusual expression that becomes the foregrounded feature in a text. So the whole poem seems to be, hinging upon this very feeling that the poet has measured his life not in years but with the feeling of grief in which he stayed in his life. So we as a reader interpret it by measuring it against the background of the regular expected pattern, and the regular expected pattern with which we compare this expression and find it deviant and foregrounded is that instead of using the year or a month, the writer has used grief to measure time. So this is one of the very useful and very, you can say, thought-provoking a message that a writer can give through the use of foregrounding or through the use of deviation, because he's breaking the regular pattern that is followed normally in the expression and writing, and he's introducing something of his own that may appear absurd and irregular and strange, but it is not something that we refute as wrong, unbelievable. We believe in it, because if a poet or a person has stayed in a particular feeling that was of grief, to him the grief had become an eternity like time, a year or a century or a month. So in this way, we believe that the writer's skill lies in the fact that he is not making use of what has already been used. Rather, he wishes to investigate his emotions through the measures of his own, and those measures of his own are deviant from what we measure life with. So that is the charm, that is the beauty of exploring anything that is foregrounded, anything that is deviation in a text or the poetry especially. You can notice many other poems as well in the modern poems, in the romantic poems also, which abound with examples of foregrounding and deviation and automatization as well. A very convincing illustration of the power of foregrounding is suggested to be of latent and very hidden significance that is furnished by modern poets who make use of stylistic devices, and they transport the pieces of ordinary writing or the non-poetic writing into the language of the poetry. So now another way of foregrounding a part of a poem or a chunk of a poem or a feature of a poem is that in the modern poets' poetry, we find that these poets transport the ordinary discourse or colloquial conversation into a poem that is composed with meter and rhyme. Now the poem structure that is quite different from the structure of a conversation or the structure of a dialogue or a speech is what does not really allow a poet to do such experimentation. But because foregrounding and deviation is one of the features which make the reader focus attention and they do not take the regularities of a text as foregrounded. That is why the writers make deviations and make use of the concept of foregrounding. Observe the examples like The Wasteland, in which T.S. Eliot has made use of a conversation or a colloquial monologue within the context of the poetic register. So in The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot, the section called the Bar Parlor Monologue, we observe the use of colloquial language. About 6-7 lines occur within the text of a poem which is composed with regular meter, rhythm and rhyme. And for the 7-6 lines or for about a stanza, the poet shifts to the colloquial conversational mode of utterance. Now this feature or this jolt that the reader faces while reading the poem attracts the attention of the reader, that why the poem that has been going on in the regular meter and rhyme pattern has been disturbed by something that does not fit into its regularity. This irregularity becomes foregrounded because it's colloquial, it's conversational, and it's in the form of a monologue. Observe this example of the same discussion that is mentioned by Jeffrey Leach in his criticism. He states that T.S. Eliot has transported or infused in the regular poem, where the structure of rhythm has been followed, a piece or a chunk from conversation. That piece or chunk from conversation makes us feel that it is appearing strange within the regularity of the poem. So a regular poem's understanding has been disturbed or has been brought to a halt when we come across this conversation or a monologue. Here T.S. Eliot transports a conversation taking place between two friends, two female friends, and it is, when Lil's husband got demobbed, I said, I didn't mince my words. I said to her myself, now Albert's coming back, make yourself a bit smart. And he wants to know what you done with that money he gave you to get yourself some teeth. Now, this seems quite out of context within a poem, because this is a conversation. But understand that this conversation is not taking place right now, that would have been taking place between two friends. Here, one of the persons is telling that he had been in a conversation with Lil, and then this conversation is reported by that person in the form of a monologue. So a single person speaking, as if telling us what he has said to Lil. And then this appears to be a conversation taking place in a parlor or a bar. That scene is something that lends it sort of a dramatic quality as well, because the setting is that of a place and a conversation, a meeting that took place between two friends, and then it is something that is now being reported to the reader, that how the persona, the speaker, met the friend and advised the friend that now that her husband is coming back, she needs to take care of herself and change a few things about herself which the husband would want to see in her. And then he also advises her or asks her that he would also ask you about money that he had sent you to, repair the teeth maybe. So that is something that appears quite, you can say, non-artistic or non-literary. But when it occurs within a very literary, very much regular, organized poem, you are surprised. As a reader, you are shocked. And this surprise and shock enhances your interest. It makes you ponder over the fact that why did Eliot infuse this chunk of conversation in the form of a monologue in a regular poem where there was the regular construction of meter and line length as well. Here the line length has been violated. The syntactical organization of a text is also not like that of a poem. So this is how foregrounding makes us understand that how a writer's whole scheme of composing a poem is depending upon that particular single foregrounded feature which he wishes the reader to pay attention to. Now, in this passage, we see that it's a monologue. And in this monologue, as I said earlier too, the friend is telling us about a conversation that took place between him and the friend. And rather than making it poetic, the writer had the ability, he had the license to really turn it into a poetic conversation as well, but he did not do so. The poet deliberately chose not to stick to the poetic pattern and to infuse colloquial, conversational prose style within the poem for a single chunk of the poem. So we see that this unusualness, this deviation, makes it appear a foregrounded feature because it causes us to pay attention to its irregularity, and we also pay attention to scrutinize it and to evaluate and investigate it. So because it is irregular, because it does not match with the rest of the scheme of the poem, it becomes foregrounded. It becomes prominent. It comes to the front as we as a reader are shocked, surprised, and interested to know why is it so? Why does it not match with the rest of the poem? So, as a reader or as a critic, we ask, what is the point of its inclusion in the poem? Why has the poet not used the same regular way of expression that was going on in the poem, and why did he deviate? Why did he violate it? What's its place, importance, and significance within the poem as far as the theme and the style and the composition of the poem is concerned? And what is its relevance to the context? To the overall context of the poem, how does it relate to? And at a more broader level, we also look at the artistic significance, the significance of its artistic composition and creation with the rest of the poem, that how is it connected to the rest of the style of the poem? What is the poet's design in creating it? Now, as we have read this chunk or the passage that is the monologue of a friend, it makes us see that the relationships that this chunk has with the rest of the poem are quite obvious, because the whole poem, the wasteland, takes place in the forms of, you can say, episodes which are giving us glimpses of the lives of various people seen through the single person or the persona. And then it reflects upon the idea of the disintegration of society after war, how the society has spiritually become degraded and disintegrated. There is moral sort of inertia or the lack of courage and spirituality in the society. People have become superficial, artificial, and pretentious, and money-minded. So the society seems to be collapsing, and this is evident in the conversation too. Now observe this conversation that seems disjointed and is connected with the same theme of disjointed society and the loss of morality and the conventions or beliefs. The way the word demobbed has been used gives a reference to the fact that Lil's husband had been serving in the army, and now after his getting injured in the army, he is coming back. So this is the sense of loss that the war has presented to the society, that certain people would lay down their life or get injured or be imputed, and then they would be no longer accepted in the society where they once had been healthy and functional members. Then the way the reference to the improvement of the appearance of the girl is concerned, that she is told that she should have new set of teeth because it really would enhance her beauty. So it is quite superficial a way of looking at life, that she wants to improve herself only by improving her appearance. Now this is the whole scheme, that is the way a conversation takes place and how it is connected with the general theme of the poem. That Eliot wants to present the idea to the reader that the conversation of the friend reveals the fact that how hollow, how superficial and pretentious the society has become. And their general concerns are only to meet outside in pubs and parlors and restaurants, and also the fact of the war which has been mentioned to enhance the feeling that war too is something that is at the back, or that is the cause of the present malaise or the disease of the spiritual inertia that the society is facing. So we as a critic or as a stylistician find out the relationship of the context of the poem, theme of the poem, with the way the poem is presented. So the chunk of conversation or a monologue seems a disruption. So that disruption is causing a disturbance in the scheme of the poem, in the structure of the poem. And so is this conversation disturbing, thought-provoking, giving the idea that what are the concerns of the common people in the society. They are superficial and hollow from the core. Jeffrey Leach terms that Eliot's use of such devices for the sake of foregrounding and making it deviant from the norms of poetic expression is something that we can also refer to as a painter's technique of making use of a collage. Now, collage is something that you make as a painter or as an artist with the help of different medium or different styles. For example, a collage can be made on a canvas by sticking bits and pieces of pictures, chunks from a newspaper or magazines. Now, if they are used, cut out, and they are stick together on a canvas, they reveal various colors, various shapes, which appear to be like a patchwork. Now, just the way in the handicraft, we patch different colors, fabrics together to create a patchwork quilt. Similarly, a collage is created by a painter by sticking pieces of pictures and newspaper bits to create a picture on the canvas. Now, this is done by Eliot in a poem, that he picks chunks and pieces which are there in various genres of expression. For example, if he is writing a poem in which he is making use of various other mediums, that is, for example, not just a poem that is in regular pattern, but also a monologue or a conversation that is there in the drama, or something that seems like storytelling. Now look how he has made use of different genres or kinds of literary writing to compose a single writing that is a poem or a literary composition. In this way, we can say that the purpose that any foregrounded feature serves in literary writing is to enhance the reader's interest and to surprise him with the very fact that how a poetic writing can be deviant, irregular, and different from the ordinary writing. So this understanding of Eliot's poem makes clear the idea that we tried to look at in the last lecture too, and now the concept of foregrounding becomes more clear when we look at it from the perspective of the analysis of a poem by T.S. Eliot. So if a poem appears the way the writers have been writing for centuries, it would not capture our attention. So that is why foregrounding, deviation, parallelism, automatization, defamiliarization as techniques are adopted by the writers. So if the modern writers' technique of making use of various other genres, various other forms of poetry are employed and used kind of cohesively within a single poem, that makes us see that how they are improving, changing the way poetic expression can be done. And there they do not limit it only to the regularity. They also make it appear strange, irregular, unusual by mixing it the way a painter would make a collage or an artist would make a patchwork quilt. So this is how Jeffrey Leach terms it, that this method of composition of writing a poem makes us see that it is like a painter's technique of using collage, in particular gumming bits of newspaper and pieces together, or maybe certain advertisements too on a canvas. And we look at it and we pay more attention because it is found somewhere else. The advertisements and pictures are not seen by the reader in the, for example, newspaper, but they are looked at on the canvas. So if we pay attention to this because it appears out of context, same happens in the understanding of poetry, where a writer may have made use of collage or gumming bits and pieces of different forms or genres of poetry together. So that becomes a foregrounded feature in the poem, and it sets itself apart from the background that is regular. So the background was not disturbed, but a few features in the writing have been used by the writers so that they appear foregrounded and they become prominent. We looked at the modern poet T.S. Eliot's poem, and in observation of the poem we found out that the poet has violated the norm or the regular way of writing poetry by transporting into it a conversational piece or a monologue that does not fit into the regular pattern of a poem. Now we can observe another example It would enhance our understanding of the text as well, and it would let us know how foregrounding is used by the writers of the modern time. This is the example taken from the poem of a celebrated and very renowned American poetess, Emily Dickinson. Emily Dickinson, in her poem, Because I Could Not Stop for Death, also sticks to the irregularity within the regular poem. And there are many features which become foregrounded and which become prominent when the reader reads it. Though the poem operates on the conventions of poetry, that it is compact, every line is too brief, and the stanzas are quite regularly maintained as far as the structure and rhythm is concerned. But if a reader who has been trained to pick up the foregrounded features and irregularities reads this poem, he would find many instances of deviation, irregularity and foregrounding, which would be surprising, which would be interesting, and which would be thought-provoking. And then the understanding of these individual features of foregrounding would help enhance the meaning of the poem and relate it to the overall context and theme of the poem. Observe this poem where she says, "Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove. He knew no haste, and I had put my labor and my leisure too for his civility." Observe this poem where we see that the writer has made a regular thing or a simple thing appear strange, unusual and different. She is addressing death as a lover or as a suitor or as a beloved. She says, "Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me." So here lies the very deviation, the very foregrounded feature, that is death being personified as a lover. The reader stops at this place with the shock, with the feeling of surprise, and with the feeling of awe and wonder that how come death that comes without asking, that comes with a very dreadful feeling for us, would be termed as something that is a beloved, somebody you love the most. Now that is what clashes with our regular understanding, our knowledge, our experience, and our belief. But it does not really mar or diminish the beauty of the poem. Rather, it enhances it, because this is the poet's way of looking at something that we have been looking at it with dread and horror. If we regularly see death, as mentioned by many poets, as something horrible that makes us part with the joys of the world, that snatches away the loved ones from us, that is painful, that is darkness. Now if a writer has a different perspective on it, that she cherishes it, she longs for it, she dreams for it the way one would dream of a lover or a beloved person, that is challenging. And how it is done through expression in writing, in poetry, is a defamiliarizing effect. It has done a kind of deviation, which in itself is a foregrounded feature of a text. The personification of death and the poet's focus on death as if it is a being, a person or a man, is the foregrounded feature in the text. Now she addresses it as a man who is filled with kindness, who is civil, who is humble, who is taking care of her, stopping before her door and making it possible that he has spared time, because the persona had no time for it. So we never see that, because death catches us, takes us away, no matter how busy we are. It doesn't ask us that, have we finished the chores that we wanted to? Then she would take us away. No, this never happens. But look here, the poetess makes us believe as if She was so busy that death could not come and take her away, and she had to put aside her chores, either her labor and her leisure, to go with death. And then death is carrying her along as if a bridegroom would take away the bride in a carriage, as if it's a journey that is romantic rather than to the grave that would be dreadful or full of horrors. Now that is quite challenging an idea, which is foregrounded by the help of the personification of death as a suitor, as a lover, as a beloved, as a person whom she dreams about. And there is no hurry, there is no fret and fear too. Rather, there is a feeling of utter calmness, utter joy in the company of death, who is the beloved. Now, observe that how the meanings of the text are changed, enhanced, and deepened with the personification of death and its placement or its comparison with something horrible. Now, death is not somebody that would be horrible, terrible, rather it is something friendly, nice, and what the persona had been dreaming about. So here the idea of foregrounding and deviation is quite evident, and we see how it challenges our perceptions. It makes us refresh our perceptions and thoughts, and that is the writer's way of presenting a reality that he or she has observed, which we as a reader might feel a bit uncomfortable with, but it ultimately gives us pleasure. That what a way of looking at things, what a way of expressing things, which we thought would never have been possible. So this is what foregrounding does. This is what is the purpose of art or literature, which would be to present something that we know as something as if we have never seen before. It renews our perception of things through the help of such functions and features of text, which are foregrounding, irregularity, and deviation. So when we say that foregrounding is a feature that is deliberately employed by the writers, and especially the poets, to enhance the meaning of their writing and to make it complicated for the reader to study what the surface meaning of the text is and what the deeper or the underlying meaning of a text is. There comes another important notion, that is of interpretation. So whenever we are faced with a challenge in the form of foregrounding and deviation, we are supposed to interpret those features. We are supposed to give meaning to those features. So without interpretation, the understanding of the features of foregrounding is not possible. So the understanding of foregrounding depends upon the skill and application of the idea of interpretation. So without interpreting anything like a symbol or a metaphor, without giving it a meaning, we may not claim to analyze a text. And as a literary stylistician or as the analyst, we cannot reach to the meanings which the writers have presented to us through the poems. So we focus on the idea of interpretation as it would enhance our meaning of the poems. It would enhance our meaning of the understanding of those features which appear deviant, unusual, strange, and worth noticing, because interpretation would lead us to understanding. Now, what is interpretation? And what is its relationship with foregrounding? That is to be understood if we are supposed to analyze those features which are either deviations, parallelism, or foregrounding. Interpretation is the action, or it is a process of understanding the meaning of any writing or any object, and it is also a way of giving explanation to things and ideas which are complex and ambiguous. So we need to interpret something which is difficult, which is meaningful, and which is unclear and strange. And the exercise of interpretation is necessary to be done for understanding of the foregrounded features in poetry. We do interpretation to understand something, to decide and decipher meanings of something, and to judge the purpose of something, why it has been done, why it has been employed or used by the poet in a poem. The importance of interpretation is that it adds clarity to ideas. It reveals the complicated, symbolic, and the between the lines meanings to the reader. And foregrounding and interpretation cannot be separated. Foregrounding cannot be explained, explicated, or revealed until or unless you perform interpretation of a text. You analyze the meanings of a text. So we can say that whenever you come across foregrounded features, either deviant or automatic, you are supposed to focus your attention as the analyst or a reader on those features and interpret what do they mean, what do they stand for, what are they referring to. So when you analyze those features from this angle, that what are their meanings, what are their implications, what are their relationships with the text and its connection with the theme and form of the poem, then we say that we are performing the task of an analyst who is trying to interpret the meanings of the texts. Interpretation in foregrounding is significant from the perspective that it distinguishes the understanding of literary work from the ordinary speech. Now observe the fact that when somebody asks you something or needs something and is asking for your help, you do not really need to make use of the skills of interpretation, because that discourse is quite straightforward. You do not give symbolic, metaphoric meanings to those utterances which somebody is, using with you for the sake of conversation, where he is communicating to you something, where he is expressing the idea of need. So there, the skill of interpretation is rarely required. But when it comes to the understanding of literary works, we can never do without interpretation. And when foregrounded features occur in a text, then the idea of interpretation becomes more vital, because without the help of interpretation and knowledge of what are the ways of interpreting a text, we can never claim to be analyzing the text as objectively and fully. Now that we understand that foregrounding and interpretation cannot be separated if we are to approach a text from a statistician's perspective, because a statistician's job is to understand the meaning of something that is ambiguous, strange, unusual, and rare. Now, if foregrounded features are a rarity or are a strange aspect of writing, then there are multiple meanings that are embedded within those foregrounded features. So, what distinguishes literary discourse from ordinary discourse is its symbols, images, literary devices, and other embellishments and features like stylistic devices which the writers use. And these features rarely occur in ordinary speech. And if they do not occur in the ordinary speech is not so complicated. What makes the literary writing more complicated is the use of the literary devices. That is why interpretation is needed. So our ordinary conversations and the writings which are not literary writings, they are quite straightforward, simple, because they do not make use of features like symbols, metaphors, devices, irony. That is why we hardly need the help of interpretation. We hardly need analysis. We just need comprehension or understanding of the language being used, and then the meanings become clear. But what makes the literary understanding complicated is that the purpose of the literary writing is not to communicate something, but to enhance the feeling, the emotion, and the intensity of the feeling that is there in the poem or the writing. That is conveyed by the writer with the help of devices, techniques, stylistic features, symbols, metaphors, and embellishments. So it means that a literary piece makes more demands on the reader. And if it demands attention, it demands concentration, for the sake of comprehension and cognition of the writing, then the writers and the critics feel the very need of the use of interpretation of those features. For the sake of the understanding that would be the overall understanding of a writing, we say that interpretation would aid us in deciphering the messages and the meanings which lie within the foregrounded features. So before we go into the understanding of what deviation is, what parallelism is, we must understand what foregrounding is and its relationship with interpretation. When the critics and stylisticians say that a literary piece is distinguished on the basis of foregrounding, and the understanding of a literary piece is no ordinary a task because it must involve interpretation, then we say that because of interpretation, the understanding of a text would become a subjective way or a subjective understanding, because interpretation would be something that we as a reader or analyst would do on the basis of our own knowledge. But in order to avoid the subjectivity of interpretation, that I may take something the way I feel about it, and another reader would feel it the way he feels about it. So where does lie the objectivity? Where does lie the investigation that is scientific, which the stylisticians claim should be the task of stylistics? So to understand that complication, that interpretation would not be subjective in this way that it would lead us to our own wishes and desires, the way we associate those with the text or the word. Rather, we are also not interested to see the writer's emotion or his life to associate the meaning of an interpretation or a symbol with the person who wrote it. Rather, our purpose is to find out what is the relationship of a symbol used in a text or a metaphor used in a text, and how is it suitable, what other evidences in the text are found that strengthen our idea or our understanding of that concept. So this is how we remove the idea of subjectivity or a personal, you can say, understanding of a text, because after all we know that stylisticians claim that literary criticism was approaching a literary writing from the author's point of view, and also from the perspective that what the reader feel interesting, how he relates to it. Whereas linguists want to enhance the understanding of the literary concepts with the help of its scientific understanding or objective understanding, that if I analyze a poem and give it one meaning, if somebody else read the same poem, he should give the same meaning, just as it is a scientific experiment whose result should be the same every time it is done. But that is only possible if there are certain parameters located and investigated within the text, so that anything that occurs as a deviant observation or a foregrounded feature would be given the meaning on the basis of the evidence found in the text. So we understand through our discussion today that foregrounding and interpretation are integrally bound together, because foregrounded features, either they are deviant or regular, would make us stop and think. And when we think over an object as a symbol or a conceit or a metaphor, our thinking would lead us to assigning meaning to that thing. And what meanings do we associate with those objects? What meanings do we assign to those symbols? It depends upon how we interpret it. It depends upon how we decipher it. So interpretation would involve the understanding of the meaning of the features which appear unusual, strange, deviant, and foregrounded. Now in our next lecture, we will focus on what are the modes and methods that are adopted for interpretation of foregrounding, because in stylistics, the stylisticians and critics have devised a way where we should avoid subjectivity and we should stick to an objective way of analysis. So that is why if foregrounded features require interpretation, then can interpretation be done the way we want it? It would be subjective or personal. Rather, there are certain parameters and frames within which interpretation of literary writings and foreground features is to be done. And that would be our focus in the coming lecture, where we will look at the ways in which we can do the understanding or the analysis of the foregrounded features with the help of 3 different modes of interpretation. Thank you.